Father, thank you so much for this day, God. I just thank you for all your many blessings that you pour upon us each and every day, Lord. And I just pray that you'd keep us ever mindful of all the many things that you do for us, Father. I pray for those that heard the message this morning, God. I pray that it touched their hearts, Father. And I pray for those that couldn't be here today for whatever reason, Lord, that you'd just bless them and bring them back to us, God. And Father, I lift Brother Anthony up to you tonight, God. Just pray that you'd give him the words you'd have him to speak, and just open our hearts to the message you'd have us to receive, Father. And we just give you all the thanks and the glory in Jesus' name. Amen. I don't guess there's any announcements or nothing.
So. Number 182. 182.
Well, I wasn't blessed to get to hear the message this morning, but I want to thank everyone that brings your kids to us for our children's church. We've been so blessed the last few weeks to have a lot of kids in there, and it just blesses me to see the little ones in there and just soaking up God's word, and just. But that wouldn't happen unless y'all were bringing them, so thank you for that. But I am proud I get to hear him tonight, so Brother Anthony, if you're ready, come bring us a message.
Camille keeps up on Facebook a lot better than I do, but she had been looking back, and then I had looked back when I was looking for the times a couple of nights ago there, and I guess it was all your VBS pictures, and it looks like you had a gang this year. And Camille was talking about, I believe someone had been baptized, a young man was baptized not too long ago. And then this morning we were reflecting on how many folks were here this morning, and to see how many, and when you've got that, there is the future right there. That's the absolute riches of the world right there. And train them up in the way they'll go. When they're old, they'll not depart from it. And that will be the hope for the future. That gives me hope as someone that has gotten up and preached from time to time. Camille has a story that she tells back home. We were visiting my parents and grandparents one day several years ago, and I don't know if y'all ever had one of these or not. I'm sure there were some folks back home at Swifton thought it seemed like a good idea at the time, one of those kinds of things. And they had broken the whole congregation up into different what they call zones or groups, and so there was someone that was over each group or could kind of help keep up with each group and encourage each group and whatever. So everybody in the church had one of those little round things, had a hole in it, and remember you could set it to different letters and squeeze it, and you could print the letters and print somebody's name and pull the little sticker off the back, and you put it on your little name tag. And so the whole board out there, there was everybody's name. And if someone wasn't there for a while, then whoever's group that was, and they could give them a call or send them a card and check on them or something like that. And different groups were responsible for different things when they had potluck and all that. And I know there were some things about that seemed like a good idea at the time, but Camille and I laugh every now and then about it, and we did again this afternoon, that while we were up there visiting the parents and grandparents about 4 or 5 years ago. This dear little old sister and her walker, when she come in the back door of that church, she completely ran over Camille with that walker. She was getting there to turn her name over now. She wanted everybody to know that her name wasn't going to be seen. And of course, Camille had no idea who that was. I knew exactly who it was. And today she asked me, while we were laughing about it once again, she said, "Did you know who that was?" I said, "Oh, yes." I said, back when they were younger, they lived up the road at the next little town, and when I was 15, that's where I started out preaching, and would go up there and would be preaching. Now, if I'm 48, and that was back when I was 15, I tell you how long ago that was. And that dear sister, she went to be with our Lord a couple of years ago, or about a year and a half or so ago. But yes, I remember her. But the funny things that you think back over the years. But again, after having got up and tried to preach the gospel for this long, and then to see so many young people today in churches like this, and see them excited and learning and obeying the gospel and accepting Christ, to me that's where it's all at. And so that gives me hope in so many ways for the future. Tonight we are looking in Matthew's account of the gospel, chapter 5, and we're going to look at verses 27 through verse 30. And Jesus, of course, is teaching here, and in the middle of it, preaching at the same time his Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, beginning in verse 27 of Matthew 5, he said, "You've heard it said of them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that the whole body should be cast into hell." Very to the point that Jesus is trying to make in his Sermon on the Mount. I said in passing this morning, and that we would look at it in a little more detail tonight. Many times Jesus did not mince words. He didn't take the long way around. He went straight to the point. It depended upon to whom he was speaking, and I've always said this in the last 10 or 12 years, that if I were ever back preaching full time again, that I would do a little bit more preaching on what Jesus didn't say in some situations. Many times I think there are those that will take what Jesus said and render a little bit different summary out of it, maybe than the point that Jesus was trying to get to. But you can always take faith, particularly in a red letter edition, when you see it in red and you see Jesus speaking it, that is something that's very important. The second part of this passage that I read to you in the Sermon on the Mount, at first it doesn't seem like it maybe goes with the first verse that I read, the first two verses there that I read, but it actually goes with it completely hand in hand. And so this evening, I want to share with you for just a few minutes some ideas along the line that the real problem is how you see. The real problem is how you see. One of the preachers that I've seen on TV from time to time says how you see the problem is the problem. All throughout the Old Testament, God would expose His people as He led them out of Egypt and led them towards the land of Canaan. He would expose them to a problem, or there'd be a problem in their way. And he was trying to see how they're going to see the problem, how you handle the problem. Of course, nearly every time without fail, except for a few like Joshua and Caleb and some of those, they saw it wrong every single time. It's amazing. Two people can look at exactly the same thing and see it completely different. The giants to Joshua and Caleb didn't mean a thing. They saw that land flowing with milk and honey just as Moses had promised, and they said, oh, it's right now's the time. Let's go get it. And those other 10 spies said, oh my goodness, you ought to see the giants, how big they are. There's no way we can take that place. And the 10 persuaded the whole nation of Israel basically to kind of drag back. And we've spoken before, and many preachers have preached on it over the ages. Some have suggested maybe 11 days journey on foot. Took them 40 years because they couldn't see the problem exactly the way it was in God's eyes. And you see that all throughout the Scriptures. And so Jesus, in His example here, when He's not mincing words, He goes straight to the subject on so many things. And it's how you see the thing that is really the problem. And I got thinking this week as I thought about what He said there, of all the things that Jesus could have said about how we see things, or how we allow ourselves to get into things, He went right for the scarlet letter, didn't He? He could have used any other topic, any other sin, if you will, in the law of Moses. He could have done that, but He didn't. They would come to Jesus from time to time, and basically it was a they versus I. He said, well, Moses said this, or in this case, he says, you have heard it said by them of old time. They said this, but I say this. He was constantly contrasting. The Pharisees say this, but I tell you this. Many times they would sort of play this game with Jesus, and they would bring a scenario to Jesus after they had thought it out. They thought completely and thought, well, we've got Him now. Now take this problem to Him. How's He going to answer this? Oh, there's no way He can answer. We've got Him now. And inevitably He would answer really, again, not mincing words, directly to the point, and completely beat them at their game. On one occasion, they brought to Him the woman caught in the act of adultery. If she was caught in the act of adultery, obviously that means it was a setup. They knew her habits or somebody else's habit. Anyway, it was a setup. They knew what was going on, and at just the right moment, jump in and catch her in the act and drag her off to the feet of Jesus and said, Moses said, stone her, what do you say? And of course, there was a little bit of a dialogue going on. He reaches down and doodles in the sand. We don't know what he wrote. And looks up and speaks to him for a second, goes back to what he's doing, looks up. They're all gone except the woman. And woman, where thine accuser? She said, Lord, I have none. He said, well, then neither do I. Then go and sin no more. Don't get in this situation again. Jesus never gave the blank check to go on doing whatever it was. He always said, don't go this way anymore. Go the other way. But when I say that He didn't mince words, when they said, well, Moses said, stone her, what do you say? Jesus said, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I mean, He could have said that 1,000 other ways, but He just went right to it. And it spoke to the heart of every one of them. They, from the oldest down to the youngest, turned and walked away because they knew their heart wasn't right. They knew there was no way that they in good conscience could pick a rock up and throw it at her, and so they began to leave. It took the younger ones a little longer for it to sink in maybe, but even they turned around and walked off. It's kind of like also Jesus is saying, well then versus now. Well, back then this is what they said, but I'm telling you right now. And He goes all through this sermon describing things that need to be done right now. He would say, well, the Pharisees say this or they do this, but I tell you, here's what you need to be doing. And then He would go on to say, unless your righteousness exceeds those, you'll in no way enter the kingdom of heaven. And so He is constantly contrasting all throughout this Sermon on the Mount. But more importantly, He goes straight to the point. He met a woman at a well one time, John tells us the story about. And they have a brief discussion about the water and how deep it is, and then there was the point of he shouldn't have even been talking to her. It was all those cultural things that you and I might completely skip over. Camille and I were studying this again lately. Being from the South, when I get to other parts of the country, I've been known to put my foot in my mouth. Now, I do that sometimes in the South also, but there are things that you don't ask in other parts of the country. We were, the other day, we were watching an educational program, and we had just returned back from Colorado that week, actually, and the speaker was saying when you're out in Colorado, you don't ask somebody, if they say they have cattle, you don't ask them how many head they have. That offends them. I work with a guy, he's 73, he worked for the USDA for a number of years, worked in Thailand, all over, was stationed up in South or North Dakota, I believe it was, for a period of time, and he says even some of the people that he worked with there in the USDA office, they were also farmers, and then they worked at USDA also, and he said there were some of them over the years, everyone knew who farmed, but never did you discuss, well, how many acres? That was an offense. Now down in the South, we say, well, I've got a farm over here on the South Fush or on the Fush, or well, how many acres you got? That doesn't offend us no more than say, well, you got cattle. Well, how many head do you have? That it's something you don't do there, because immediately then the implication is, well, there's X number of head and it takes hundreds of acres to feed them out west, and then you have the issue of water rights and all that. And again, up in the north, I found out that up in the north or northwest that there were some issues that went on there. So Jesus was at the well talking to this woman, which was, apparently completely unacceptable culturally speaking. And they're talking about the water in the well, and they're talking about, prophets and where you go worship and all those kinds of things. But then Jesus tells her, he says, go call your husband. And she said, I don't have one. And this is sort of what it would say in the whole paraphrase. He says, well, you're honest about that, and the man you're living with now is not your husband either. Ouch. Imagine having a discussion with a complete stranger and it ends up being Jesus, and of course she knows there's something. And then when she goes back and does tell whoever it is that she goes back and associates, she said, I've met the Master. He told me things about myself that nobody even knows. She knew it was Jesus. Didn't offend her a bit. But Jesus did not mince words. He went straight to the point. The rich young ruler, we call him sometimes. Don't know exactly why we call him that, but he was definitely rich. I don't know if he was a ruler. Perhaps he was. There was something that over the years we have picked up from that on the passage. But remember, he came to Jesus, and he was so excited. He was really genuinely excited. He came to Jesus, and he said, Master, what do I need to do? And Jesus at first said, well, what about Moses and the law and all the? He said, I've kept all that from my youth up. Now I've heard speakers and preachers get up and say, well, there's no way that anybody ever kept all that. That's not the point. I don't think, even under the law of Moses, you can make mistakes, and you made amends, if you will, by keeping the law with the sacrifice. You could be a sinner and still keep the law. Does that make sense? You had to constantly keep doing all those things, and Christ put an end to all that by dying once for all. But this young man, he said, Master, he said, I've done that from my youth up. Since I was a kid, I've been focused on the law of Moses. And Jesus said, you got one more thing then you need to do. Go sell all you got, give it to the poor, and come follow me. Wow. I mean, that man would have rather Jesus told him anything but that. He just went straight for it. And so, as I have in my notes, Jesus often went straight for the jugular, as we sometimes say on the farm. He didn't beat around the bush and mince words about it. He just went right straight to it. There was that woman that had the daughter that had died. She was a Canaanite. And by the way, about that rich young ruler, Scripture says that Jesus looked on him and loved him. Jesus never questioned whether he had kept the law or not, so I'm not going to question it if Jesus didn't question it, and that's why I say that about that. And then there was that story of that Canaanite woman. Her daughter had died. And she came to Jesus. And now when I say a Canaanite woman, that means she's a Gentile also. And so she comes to Jesus, and she says, I think you can heal my daughter. I know you can heal my daughter. Will you heal my daughter? You remember what Jesus told her? One of the harshest things to us, it would look like from the outside, one of the harshest things, again, there was no reason why a Gentile woman should have any discussion with a Jewish man in that day and time. It was just strictly against all the cultural rules of that day. And you remember what Jesus said when she said, you can heal my daughter, Jesus said, it's not meet to cast the children's bread to the dogs. Wow. Most of us would have probably turned around and walked off at that. Almost everybody probably, but not this woman. She had faith in Jesus. Some of the things that she had seen and heard about, she said, this guy can do things. You remember her reply? I mean, he just pounces all over her, calls her a dog, basically. Of course, Jesus knew her heart. And she said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the children's table. And he said, I've not seen that kind of faith. That's what I'm looking for right there. And of course, go your way. Your daughter's healed. Your daughter's alive. You have what you asked for. And so Jesus had some very frank conversations. On another occasion, he was at a party, and he had been criticized for being a friend of sinners. He had been accused of being a drunkard. He had been accused of being a glutton, because he seemed to be from time to time where the sinning was going on, and so he was considered with that, the way the Pharisees looked at him. He was called the friend of sinners, a drunken and a glutton, a wine-bibber, and all those things were said about him. But Simon has him over one night, and it's some kind of pretty good party apparently, and he's in a position of honor there as they're having a discussion, reclined around the table, and Jesus is speaking. And while he's speaking, there's a woman just behind him to his feet, who after hearing his story begins to cry. And she cries so uncontrollably, and she begins to wash his feet and then to dry his feet with her own hair. She didn't have anything else. And you remember Simon, self-righteous Simon. Simon looks across him without even a word being said between him and Jesus. He says in his heart, and Jesus heard it plain and clear, if you're who you say you are, you wouldn't let a woman like that near you. And he looks back across the table at Simon. He says, Simon, can I tell you a story? Let me tell you about two debtors and what they owed. And of course, one owed a tremendous amount and one didn't, and whatever. And the Lord forgave both of them. He said, who do you think probably loved the Lord the most? And Simon said, well, probably the one that was forgiven the most. And he said, Simon, you didn't wash my feet when I came in. You didn't do this for me when I came in. And she's not ceased to wash my feet and dry my feet and all those things. And I think Simon probably got the point. But Jesus, again, went straight for the jugular on it. And in this sermon, over and over, if you want to talk about righteousness and the kingdom of heaven and all of these things that Jesus teaches us about, he says over and over, don't be like the Pharisees, they're hypocrites. Don't be like that. Rather than say, well, just be like this or be like this or be like this, Jesus doesn't stop there. He looks at the Pharisees as a group and says, don't be like that above all. Because that's an example of what not to be like, and God forbid that we ever look at anyone through the lens that those Pharisees did, and all of their self-righteousness. Yes, Jesus could have spoken of anything to get to the point of the matter here in Matthew chapter 5, but he evokes the scarlet letter. He uses the word adultery, and can you imagine what might have been going on? I've been standing up in front of crowds now, well, really since I was 15, I guess. Been teaching crowds since I was, I don't know what age I was, but I know I was teaching, I think in 91 was when I began teaching. And I tell classes and I tell congregations sometimes that I've got the best seat in the house. I may be standing, but I got the best seat in the house. I can tell who's paying attention, who's not, and who's distracted, and who's got this going on and that going on. I teach some classes that are 3 hours long. A lot of them, people try to maximize time and not have to come to campus too many days, and so sometimes they come one day and it's 3 hours long. I had some labs back in college that were 5 hours long. Kyle experienced that recently. He got into pharmacy school since we last visited. He's fixing to start his third week of pharmacy school, and he told his mom this week that it is going to be something unlike what he's ever experienced. He and I had a discussion about that a week or two ago when he came to the house, and I said, oh, it's fixing to get really interesting, and he's going to have to adjust. You can imagine how tough it is, and then he'll be just fine. But he's had some 5-hour chemistry labs that went on all day, and so he's kind of used to some of that. But Jesus is out there speaking on the hillside, and he's making a day out of it. It's kind of a long thing that's going on out there, and I just wonder, maybe not because Jesus was speaking, Maybe everybody hung on every word. I don't know. You know, there was a story later on where a preacher was preaching and it went on for a while and somebody fell out of the window because they fell asleep. That kind of stuff does happen. But can you imagine they're on a grassy hillside there maybe, and he's preaching, and it's a beautiful sunny day, and the clouds and the birds are floating by, and this one may be, you know, looking off into the distance, and this one may be daydreaming. This one's wondering, well, what's for lunch? Are we going to get there? My goodness, the supper's going to burn, or something like that. I just wonder. And then right out of the blue, I mean, just boom. If you look at some of the other things that are going on here, Jesus just right out of the blue says, you've heard it said of them of old times, thou shalt not commit adultery. And I mean, everybody's right back on task then. When they heard that word, you got everybody's attention. He'd been talking about giving. He talks about giving. He talks about praying. He talks about a variety of things. But when you play that card, I mean, everybody hears that, right? When you say the word adultery, that gets everybody's attention. So I suspect Jesus had everybody's attention now. Everybody is reeled right back in and honed in on what it is that Jesus is trying to get across. But then he goes on and say, you know, be careful what your eyes see. Be careful what your hands do. He is not teaching on adultery. He uses that as an example to make the point that how you see things is the point. The heart of man's problems is the heart of man, as Dr. Rogers would say so many times. And you see with your heart. This is not about physical eyes and physical hands. It's about how we look at things. And the big problem is how you see things. And so seeing is not an eye issue. It's a heart issue. And just like there are physical things that can happen to us with our eyes, and you'll notice this year, I'm trying to leave these bifocals on. I gave in and let Dr. Adams talk me into them. And I wanted just little cutoff readers, and he said, I don't think you're going to like those. So I've been still trying to get used to wearing these things all the time. And the part I'm looking through now is just a bunch of clear glass sitting there doing absolutely nothing. But that little part right down below it, I really need, because I can't see stuff like right there anymore. But there are problems with nearsightedness. There's problems with farsightedness. Some people can't see far off. Some people can't see near up. The same thing is true spiritually. Presbyopia. We think Presbyterian, old earth, literally, is what that means. Presbyopia is old eyes. And as we get older, we many times have presbyopia. Dr. Dina Dale says he can take your age and write you a glasses prescription, because it's almost a linear relationship as we get older. Here's what's happening to our eyes as they get older. It's that mathematically predictable. And so there are all kinds of vision problems, and there are also all kinds of heart problems. I mentioned that two people can see the exact same thing and see it completely different. Sometimes you can see something, or you can see what you thought you saw, and it not necessarily be that. Drive by something and go, oh wow, that, you know. We were just talking about statistics and scientific methodology this first week in biology, and I said our whole court system is based on what we call hypothesis testing. Either he's guilty or he's not guilty, and there are two verdicts that the jury could come up with. Either he's guilty or he's not guilty, and sometimes we get it wrong. And our system is designed so that we would rather 100 men go free, and this is the quote, 100 guilty men go free than to lock up one person that should not be locked up. That's the principle upon which our system is based. But you can see things wrong. I asked the class, I said, does the jury actually know what happened? The answer, of course, is no. If you're an eyewitness, you know what happened, but you can't be on the jury. You know, that sounds like an odd system. Well, there are people that see things or hear things, but they see it wrong and they hear it wrong. And so you have to really, really be careful of that. I might have told you one time I had a student that quoted me on something, and I said, whoa, wait a minute, did I really say that? Oh no, you didn't say it that way, you said it this way. And I'm like, now come on, quote me if you want to quote me, but you know, this was a high school situation. And but be sure to quote me. Solomon told his son over in 23rd chapter, book of Proverbs, he said, be careful what you see. Be careful what you crave. Be careful what your eyes crave, son. And some beautiful things, not from someone that lived it right, but from somebody that knew from experience to a great extent. When Solomon would tell his son about certain kind of women. Camille, I've heard her tell those boys over and over and over and over that there was two kinds of women in Proverbs. One of them you want to stay away from. And so far they've been really good about doing that. But there's two kinds. Solomon unfortunately had learned a lot of his wisdom through practical everyday experience. God gave him a blank check on wisdom, but then you recall Solomon, if you go off and read all of the stuff that he got himself into. Ecclesiastes looks towards the end that he's kind of got everything on solid ground, but he writes some really good things over in the 23rd chapter of Proverbs. He says, when thou settest down to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before thee. Put a knife to thy throat if thou be a man given to appetite. In other words, he said, somebody that is somebody takes you out to dinner or they have a meal prepared, don't be a glutton right there and just, eat everything on the table. Do not do that. But then he goes on to say, don't be desirous of his dainties, his little fancy things. Don't get too addicted to the caviar. How's that sound? I've never eaten caviar. Now, I've sold some caviar before, back fishing on the Black River. We sold a little bit of caviar back in the day. I never ate any of it. But there are people that like fish eggs, and they'll pay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for that stuff, a little old bitty tin can, and you can put those fish eggs on a cracker, and supposedly they're good. But he says, don't get too addicted to craving that kind of stuff, because you're not going to be able to afford that. He says, for their deceitful meat, labor not to be rich. Cease from thine own wisdom. Wilt thou set thine eyes on that which is not? Be careful what you look at, things that are completely unreasonable. For riches certainly make themselves wings, and they fly away as eagles towards heaven. Eat thou not the bread of him that abideth, that hath an evil eye, someone that looks at things completely wrong. Don't get in relationships with them. Neither desire thou his dainty meats, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. That verse that we're familiar with. Eat and drink and say he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. And so, be careful what your heart gets to seeking after. And then he goes on later on in that same chapter. He says, my son, if your heart be wise, my heart shall rejoice, even mine. Yea, my rein shall rejoice when thy lips speak right things. Let not thine heart envy sinners, but be thou in the fear of the Lord all the day long. For surely there's an end, and thine expectations shall not be cut off. So he says in that passage, he's telling his son about certain things that you can see in this life. And he says, don't make the mistake of looking at them wrong and seeing them wrong and get to craving and chasing after those kinds of things. One of my favorite stories, and my favorite part, I said this morning, I cut my teeth on Genesis and Exodus and Judges and 1st and 2nd Kings. One of my favorite whole periods of history there, of course, in the Old Testament is the life and times of Elisha. Now, there were some good things going on during the days of Elijah, but you remember Elisha said, Elijah had said, well, what is it you want? And he says, when you're taken away, I want a double portion of whatever you've had. I've seen you do some stuff. And he says, well, if you see me when I'm taken away, then I'll give you. And if you go back and add up the things that were done during the life of Elijah, it would seem like there was twice as many wonders done in the days of Elisha. But I thoroughly love that period of history when Elisha was trying to persuade the tribes to the north, the nation of Israel, trying to persuade them to return to the Lord, and it was just a losing battle. But nonetheless, Elisha did a real good job at least trying to do that. But you remember there was that occasion where the king of Assyria, basically, he is sore displeased with Elisha. The king of Israel stays displeased with him a fair amount of the time, and sometimes there's even discussion between those two kings. Whose fault is it? It's that prophet's fault. And you remember, and so they're always looking for Elisha. And finally, that king of Assyria says, "That's it. I've had enough. Find out where he lives. I want y'all to go kill him." And he doesn't send some small group out there to do the job. He knows some things have been done through Elisha, and so he sends a formidable host out there. And during the night, before dawn, apparently they have surrounded the house where Elisha is at. And in the morning, as getting ready to start whatever things for the day, the servant of Elisha goes out, you remember. And, he's probably yawning and stretching and getting water out of the well or whatever. I don't know. I can't imagine, but something along those lines. And then as he looks up at the surrounding ridge line that goes all the way around the village, there's a complete host that he can't even count. And he realizes they've got us this time. And he goes back in the house and he tells Elisha, we're surrounded. Did Elisha doubt? Did Elisha waver? Was Elisha worried for 1 second about it? Not a bit. His prayer was this, and it says that when the servant of the man of God was risen up early and gone forth, behold, an host encamped the city, both horses and chariots. And his servant said unto him, Alas, my master, how shall we do? And he answered and said, Fear not, for those that be with us are more than they that be with them. This prophet was not quite the character of faith. If you go back and study, if this was the same Gehazi, the servants that Elisha had, I can't imagine how you could be that close to him and still never get the message. But you can. Even Judas was with Jesus nearly all the way to the end and still completely missed the picture. And so this servant still hasn't got it together. And Elisha said, oh, don't worry about it. There's more on our side than on their side. You can imagine what that must have looked like if you just looked at it through the lens of physical eyes. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened his eyes. And the young man, when he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. You couldn't touch him. He was just looking at it through the wrong lens. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. And yet sometimes we get up every day and we go take on the battles of flesh and blood, don't we? It's a spiritual victory. It's a spiritual battle. And sometimes we need to see it for that. Now the irony is this, at first the servant couldn't see what was out there, and the irony is this, those that are surrounding the city looking for Elisha, you remember then they were struck with blindness. And Elisha's servant then was, oh, well, we can kill them all now. And Elisha's, no, we're not going to do that. Take them out there and lead them back. Tell them to go back home, and that calmed things down for just a little while over that. So that's sort of the irony. But we have to be careful how we see things. In biology, I don't think I've ever told you this story before. In biology, the man that really got it started back in 1665 is the date that you'll see in the books, a man by the name of Robert Hooke. And back then, you had to understand that those scientists, they were not just scientists. They were into art. They were into theology. That Jewish math physics teacher that I used to work with, one day I said something about Robert Hooke, and he said, you guys know Robert Hooke? And I said, are you kidding? He got biology started. He said, I didn't know that. He knew him as a physicist. And then we got to talking about Sir Isaac Newton and some of his works and whatever. And he said, did you ever read any of Isaac Newton's theology? And I said, I didn't know he wrote any theology. And he laughed at me. He said, oh, he probably wrote more theology than he did about physics and calculus and math and all that kind of. So back then they were sort of a jack of all trade and wrote about all sorts of stuff. But anyway, Robert Hooke was the guy that looked at a cork one day and realized that each of those little holes must be something important. He called them cells for a little room or small chamber. And so he becomes the father of biology in the Renaissance because of his discovery of the cell, or at least he's the first guy to at least acknowledge that those were the foundation of life. I joke and tell folks sometimes that even in second grade, back at that little school at Swifton, in second grade I knew who the valedictorian was going to be. Now you normally don't start worrying about that stuff for a while, but in second grade I was already worried about that. And so were two other kids that I went to school with. Anthony Hewlin, there were two Anthony H's, so he's Hewlin and I'm Holt. And then Tammy Hutchinson. And so you had the three H's, the H factor, sometimes the teachers would say as we went on through school, Holt, Hewlin, and Hutchinson. And we battled it out. I mean, we were trying to get all those certificates at the end of the school year. You know, I look back on that and, you know, okay. Yeah, it was a big thing, but okay. It wasn't as big as I thought it was. Probably, and some of you, if you weren't interested in those little paper certificates that you got at the end of the year, it was like, okay, it's time for Holt, Hewlin, and Hutchinson. It's time for their ceremony for the year. Randy Smith did not care a bit about any of those things, but he had perfect attendance all the way through school. And I look back on it, that was bigger than any piece of paper they gave me. I mean, that was what he liked to do. And so we were competitive, and we got all the way up to about 10th grade, and Hewlin, he said, my goodness, this is getting tough. He said, I'm not interested. So he bowed out, and it was Tammy and I, and we went at it, I mean, trying to be the top dog. Tammy to this day is a lot smarter than I am. She's a school teacher up at Pocahontas. She's a lot smarter than I am, but I could always seem to figure the test out. I could always seem to figure the test out. We went off to college together our senior year in high school, and as I look back on it now, I don't really think it was because Mr. Robert thought we necessarily needed to go over there, but I think the teachers were probably tired of us by then. Could y'all go to ASU your senior year? And so we only needed English and a home ec, so we had classes first 2 hours, and then they were going to let us go to ASU. Now, we found out there was this thing called a Pell Grant, and to 2 poor kids off the farm in Jackson County, that was more money than we'd ever seen back then. It was my tuition that semester. Brace for this. My tuition, this is everything now, full time, 13 hours at Arkansas State University was $365. Now let the economists try to figure out why education prices have to keep going up as much as they do. You know, there's something going on. Anyway, we won't get into that. You don't bite the hand that feeds you, I guess. And we headed off to ASU, and she took 12 hours, I took 13 hours. One of the books we had to read in a history class, we had to read The Grapes of Wrath, and I probably have said before that you can live the Great Depression, Dust Bowl, by the time you can read it. I mean, that book is that thick. I never did read The Grapes of Wrath. She knew all about Cliff Notes, and so she bought the Cliff Notes, read about it, told me about it on the way to school that morning. We got over there and had a big essay test on the Grapes of Wrath in Dr. C. Calvin Smith's history class. 2 days later, we got our test back, and one of us did really good, and one of us didn't. And she looked at me, and she gave those famous words that she'd said over and over and over to me since 2nd grade. She said, I hate you. I said, no, you don't. You love me. No, I hate you. You do this to me all the time. It's 10 years now you've been doing this to me. And I said, well, I'm sorry, Tammy. You told me the story. I just answered the questions. I don't know. Oh, she said, I just can't stand that. Back in 10th grade, what she didn't know at that time was, back in 10th grade biology, first lesson we'd cover, guy discovered the cell. On the test there on Friday, there was a fill-in-the-blank question. The father of the cell was blank. And I could not remember Robert Hooke's name to save my life. And I thought, I know Tammy's going to know the answer to this. And she's going to make 100 on this test, and now she's going to be the valedictorian, and I'm not. Folks that want to be valedictorians, we have our own special set of problems that we have to deal with. And I thought, what am I going to do? And I just sat there and looked at that blank and couldn't figure out what to put in that blank. Tim Goza sat in front of me. Tim was not worried about being the valedictorian. Tim was just hoping he would graduate from high school. You know, we joke sometime at the college level, and we say there's summa cum laude, and then there's thank you laude. And Tim will tell you he graduated from high school thank you laude. He was just happy to get through. He was happy to get through. He was sitting right in front of me. I didn't look at his test on purpose. I did not look at his test on purpose. But there in the blank was Robert Hooke. And so I wrote down Robert Hooke. I felt so bad about it all that night, and next day I met Mr. Richardson out in the hall before class, and I said, I copied an answer off to him yesterday. He was so sick of me, you know, just this pathetic desire to be the valedictorian, I guess. He said, oh, Holt, and he just did that and turned around and walked off. That's all he ever said about it. And so I tell biology classes that the foundation of biology I cheated on in 10th grade because I wanted to be the valedictorian. I didn't mean to. But you know how it is, you can't unlook. Now you wonder what the point of this story was, didn't you? You can't unlook. And I had looked and I wrote that answer down. Now Tammy didn't realize that had taken place. 10 years goes by. I taught her in biology at ASU. She came back to college later, and I taught her in biology. And then one day, after I had her in a college class, we're sitting around at our 10-year reunion, and this would have been our 30-year reunion. Is that right? This is our 25-year. No, this is 30. This is our 30th, and we didn't get together. We talked about it here a while back, and we didn't get together. And anyway, we We're sitting around talking at our 10-year reunion about what all we'd been doing. And I said, well, I've been teaching biology and everything. And I said, Tim, I just want to tell you. I said, I copied Robert Hooke off you. The first question on that first test in 10th grade biology, I copied Robert Hooke off you. He said, Holt, he said, Tammy sat in front of me. I copied every test off of her. And Tammy looked at me and said, I hate you. But my point is, you can't unlook. And what Jesus is saying, it's not just about that. Many times it's what you do with what you see. How your heart perceives it and what you do with it. Eve looked at the fruit, and before you know it, Satan had sold her a new used car, as we used to say. Sold her a bill of goods. And she looked at it. Remember, you know Genesis is what she looked at it and said, this looks pretty good. Well, we'll make preserves out of that and pies, and it's good for food, and it's just practical. And before you know it, because she looked at it and looked at it too long, it got to looking pretty good, and then brought some home to Adam, and he did the same thing, and then there you go. The rest is history. As we say, David stood out on the balcony overlooking his kingdom one night from the palace. And off in a direction, he saw the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. We wouldn't even know the story if that had been the end of that, but it wasn't the end of that. It's what he did with what he saw. And because of that, the prophet would later come to him and say, this child will not live, and the sword will never depart from your house. I don't know what part of forever is not applicable today, because when I look at the problems that are still going on in that part of the world, when that prophet looked at him and he said, the sword will not depart from your house forever. Forever is still going on. And how sad it is when you see something and then you do something with it. But Jesus says, if you see someone, in this case, if you've lusted after her, you've already committed adultery in your heart. Jesus in this sermon and other places says, if you're angry with a brother without cause, you're guilty of murder at the heart level. Oh, they didn't want to hear that. And all throughout here, he talks about some of these other things. And so he uses the subject of adultery to make the point that it is all about a heart problem. Watts, I love the line from ages past now when he said, how shall the young secure their hearts and guard their lives from sin? Thy words the choicest rules imparts to keep their conscience clean. Focusing on the word, staying focused and not looking at all of these other things that so easily distract us. I don't know why this song came to mind this week as I was typing all of this out. Merle Haggard had a song several years ago, and I say several years ago, it's been a long time ago now. Merle Haggard, of course, growing up in that era, and some of his music is very reflective of that era, but having grown up during the Great Depression and moving to a labor camp and all of that. Do you remember the song? He wrote a song about his mother. And he said, a canvas-covered cabin in a crowded labor camp stand out in this memory I revived. 'Cause my daddy raised a family there with two hard-working hands and tried to feed my mama's hungry eyes. He dreamed of something better, and my mama's faith was strong, and us kids were just too young to realize that another class of people put us somewhere just below. One more reason for my mama's hungry eyes. I remember Daddy praying for a better way of life, but I don't recall a change of any size, just a little loss of courage as their age began to show and more sadness in my mama's hungry eyes. Mama never had the luxury she wanted, but it wasn't because my daddy didn't try. She only wanted things she really needed. One more reason for my mama's hungry eyes. And of course the last line of the song says, oh, I still recall my mama's hungry eyes. The hungry eyes for all of those things. And of course that's a very sad story from a very sad situation that so many were in at that particular time. But the hungry eyes, wanting things that you cannot have or things that are not good for us, is something that we have to be careful about. Jesus said back in the Beatitudes there, he said, blessed are those that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. The underlying message is this: you have to be careful for what you hunger and thirst. Because if you get to hungering and thirsting for the wrong things, it'll lead you in the wrong direction. And Jesus said if we'll focus on Him and put Him and His kingdom first, then all these other things will be taken care of. And so what is it that our soul actually craves for? You know, when you think about Eve and when you think about David, when you think about all these things, and Jesus is talking about keep our heart looking in the right direction, seldom is it something that suddenly happens. In life, it's generally a gradual move. Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom. And in the next story, when Lot pops up, he's in the city gate with the city councilmen, the city elders. He's a part of town. And so I don't know what went on in there. The moving toward Sodom got him moved into Sodom. Casting Crowns had a song a few years ago. I've never heard them sing it, I'll be honest. And I didn't YouTube it. I've had these words down for some time now, but I've never actually listened to the song. But it plays on that little song that we learned when we were that big. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little hands, what you do. Be careful, little feet, where you go. There's a Father up above looking down in tender love. Be careful about all of those things. That's a good lesson. And Casting Crowns took it and turned a real good poem out of it. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. It's the second glance that ties your hands as darkness pulls the strings. Be careful, little feet, where you go, for it's the little feet behind you that are sure to follow. It's a slow fade when you give yourself away. It's a slow fade when black and white have turned to gray. Thoughts invade, choices are made, a price will be paid. When you give yourself away, people never crumble in a day. It's a slow fade. It's a slow fade. Be careful, little ears, what you hear. When flattery leads to compromise, the end is always near. Be careful, little lips, what you say. For empty words and promises lead broken hearts astray. It's a slow fade when you give yourself away. It's a slow fade when black and white have turned to gray. Thoughts invade, choices are made, a price will be paid. When you give yourself away, people never crumble in a day. The journey from your minds to your hands is shorter than your thinking. Be careful, if you think you stand, you may be sinking. It's a slow fade when you give yourself away. It's a slow fade when black and white have turned to gray. Thoughts invade, choices are made, a price will be paid. When you give yourself away, people never crumble in a day. Daddies never crumble in a day. Families never crumble in a day. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. For the Father up above is looking down in love. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. So what's the solution to the problem? Jesus said, if it takes it, extreme measures are better than losing your soul. He says, if your right eye offend thee, pluck it out. You're better off without it. Did Jesus mean that we ought to be gouging our eyes? No. You look at some groups around the world that are so extreme about those kinds of things, and physically they beat themselves, or they walk in line and beat the person in front of them, trying to beat sin out of us, and we know that that's nonsense. He says if your right hand offends thee, and of course the world is a right-handed world for the most part, he says cut it off and get rid of it. You're better off without it than that the whole body would be cast into hell complete if it leads you astray. When Jesus gives his parable of the sower, the disciples challenged him on his teaching strategies, and he said this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart and should be converted, and I'd heal them. And then he specifically in that parable, he had said about the thorny ground hearers when he explains what happened to them. He said, he also that received seed among the thorns is he that heareth the word, and then the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. In short, you're better off without some very seemingly important things than you are to have it all and then to lose your soul. Way back then when I was preaching over in East Jackson County, a man told me the story one night, and I may have shared this with you before. They would have prayer meeting, and he told the story of a man that every week would come to prayer meeting, and they would take prayer requests, and then they would all collectively pray about them. Every week the same guy had the same story to tell. On Monday he intended to do better, and by Tuesday he'd gotten caught in the web of sin, and there on Wednesday night there he was at prayer meeting wanting prayers to help get out of the web of sin. And this went on and on and on for weeks and months and years, and every time it would be the same. On Monday I really intended to. I was doing better, but then I got tangled in the web of sin, and finally one brother one prayer meeting night said, kill the spider. Jesus said if that's what it takes, that's the answer. Get rid of the things that make you see wrong and lead you in the wrong direction. It's all about how we see, and we see with our heart. And Jesus in the parable said, in the Beatitudes said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Would you pray with me? Dear Lord, we thank you again that we've had a beautiful day. It's been sunny. The rain has ceased. We love the rain, and we know you send it, but it has ceased, and we know now that it's time for fall and things to dry. And we thank you so much for the beautiful day that we've got to enjoy. Thank you for the time that we've got to come together to sing and fellowship, and pray and study from your word. Father, we pray as we deal with a section of your word that seems pretty harsh, that we'll realize the lesson comes from a loving God and a loving teacher, and we want to live in the right direction and not be cast into hell, as that verse says, because of anything that might lead us astray. My prayer is that you'll be with all those that have been here today. Father, help them to have a good week. Help them to see things right and to see things clearly. And help us to have the right heart towards you, towards your word, towards those that are around us in this world, because we know out of the heart come the very issues of life. Father, thank you for Jesus, and thank you that he came, lived, and died for us on that cross, and help us to see that in the right way, as we said this morning. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. If you're here this evening and there's something that I pray with you about, she'll play one of the best songs that's ever been written. If there's anything that we can help anyone with, it has been so good to be back with you. Next Sunday morning, Lord willing, working on a brand new sermon. Something brand new that I haven't even thought about trying to preach on before. The title of the sermon, The World That Then Was. And I want us to take a look at something Peter says about the way things were then and the way they are now. And I'll try to have done my homework about some biology and about some science and some other things. And we'll talk a little bit about the world that then was, Peter says, before the flood, and what happened to it, and then what will inevitably happen to this world that we live in. So I invite you to come back. I'll do the best that I can on that and preparing for that. Any other thing that we need to mention before we're dismissed? Nothing? Would you please stand? Paxton, would you dismiss us?
Lord Jesus, thank you for this day, and thank you for the good preaching and teaching we've heard today. Lord, just thank you for the privilege of being in your house. Lord, just please help us to go out into the world that doesn't know you, and help us to spread your word and spread your love as best we can. Trust in my prayer. Amen.